August 1944. Eastern Poland. The forest smelled of sap, soot, and the faint metallic sting of overheating engines. A column of German armor crawled through a narrow clearing, treads sinking into soft earth that had been hammered by summer rains. The lead vehicle, hulking, square-shouldered, its silhouette, unmistakable even through drifting smoke, moved with the slow, deliberate caution of a creature aware of its own fragility. Inside, the air was thick with oil vapor, and the breath of 5 men who no longer trusted the steel surrounding them. Their eyes tracked every vibration, every hiss, every temperature spike on the gauge. The tank's armor was unmatched, its firepower legendary, but the crew sat as if riding a barely contained explosion. By dusk, Soviet scouts had already intercepted its movement. By midnight, reports traveled through multiple echelons, a heavy variant, possibly the model with the long-barrel gun. Its reputation arrived long before its shells. The tank's commander, Feldwebel Kurt Müller, knew exactly what the Red Army feared, and exactly what his own men dreaded. He wiped condensation from the periscope glass, his gloves blackened with residue from a coolant leak, patched only hours earlier. The vehicle was a masterpiece on paper. In practice, a puzzle of compromises and catastrophic tolerances. A sudden jolt shook the hull. Not enemy fire, not terrain, just the gearbox deciding to remind the crew who truly controlled the pace of this march. A short sentence shattered the moment: we stop, we die. Müller's reply was equally simple: we move, we might. A paradox wrapped in steel. That night, the tank advanced into a region already mapped by German intelligence as operationally hostile, meaning the Soviets knew it well, and fuel depots were scarce. The weight of the machine strained every bridge. Every kilometer consumed more fuel than a half-track used in a day, and every meter invited the same whispered question inside the cramped hull: will it break first, or burn first? Extract from Müller's field letter, intercepted post-war. They say the Allies fear it, but they do not hear the metal screaming inside when we shift from second to third. By dawn, the clearing opened into a devastated village, burned rafters, shattered carts, a single well still standing. Müller ordered a halt, not for reconnaissance, but because the engine temperature crept past a threshold he had learned to respect more than enemy artillery. The crew exited in pairs, touching the armor like men checking the pulse of a dying animal. The tank was Germany's pride, but it was also a quiet confession that the war was slipping, and engineering brilliance had replaced strategic clarity. A Soviet artillery patrol spotted them moments later. A flash, a whistle, a detonation short of the tree line. The crew scrambled back inside, sealing themselves into a fortress that doubled as a furnace. Müller barked coordinates, the gunner aligned the long barrel, and the shot that followed punched through the morning haze with the kind of authority that had made Allied crews abandon entire positions at the mere rumor of this tank's approach. Yet even as the shell found its mark, the engine sputtered, steam hissed, something cracked beneath the flooring. Fear, triumph, doubt, all in the same breath. The tank Germany feared was real, so was the reason its own crews hated it. The tank's origins began not in the field, but in conference rooms thick with cigarette smoke and shrinking timelines. By mid-war, German high command had begun asking an impossible question: how do we counter every Allied tank at once? The answer became a machine that combined breathtaking firepower, thick armor, and catastrophic mechanical demands. A weapon designed in a vacuum of ideal conditions that combat never offered. According to armored doctrine circulated through Berlin that spring, the vehicle's mission profile was clear: break enemy spearheads, hold key ground, project fear. Fuel consumption, transport limitations, or crew survivability were footnotes. The war planners wanted a symbol, an iron argument that Germany still controlled the battlefield, but symbols require sacrifice. Orders sent to Müller's battalion 2 weeks earlier captured this logic with clinical precision. Heavy units will reinforce sectors where Soviet penetration is probable. Expect attrition. Vehicle losses secondary to operational shock effect. In translation, your tank is more valuable psychologically than operationally. Use it even if it kills itself doing the job. Müller read the communiqué twice. His gunner read it once. The driver refused to read it at all. The strategic context only worsened as logistics unraveled. Every heavy tank demanded spare parts that factories could no longer produce at scale. Every kilometer forward required fuel that convoys could barely deliver. The vehicle's designers had imagined flat terrain, ideal maintenance crews, and uninterrupted supply lines. The Eastern Front provided the opposite. By July, entire units reported immobilized tanks abandoned not due to enemy fire, but due to snapped final drives, burnt clutches, warped turret rings, or engines pushed beyond endurance. Some reports included phrases like unfit for maneuver or immobile but combat capable if towed into position. Others simply read, crew evacuated, vehicle lost. Extract from a quartermaster's frustration-filled report. Every success is paid with parts we do not have. The tank kills the enemy, and then kills itself. Yet High Command insisted the vehicle remain in frontline doctrine. Their reasoning was partly psychological. Wherever the tank appeared, Allied forces exaggerated its numbers. Soviet interrogations frequently mentioned the big one with the long gun, often assuming entire brigades of them existed. In reality, mechanical attrition meant only a fraction reached battle, so the myth grew faster than the machine itself. Inside the hull, this myth translated into pressure. Crews knew they were inside a weapon the enemy dreaded, yet one that demanded near superhuman finesse to keep operational. The tank behaved like an apex predator with fragile bones. It could shatter an enemy armored column in 3 shots, and then immobilize itself by simply reversing too sharply. The battalion commander's briefing before deployment drilled this contradiction into every crewman. You are to engage enemy armor at long range. Avoid close combat. Avoid rapid maneuver. Avoid prolonged idling. Avoid overheating. Avoid soft ground. Muller whispered to his loader afterward. So, avoid tank warfare. A tired smile answered him. War had become instructions for impossible conditions. By the time the battalion reached eastern Poland, frontline commanders valued each heavy tank like a mobile bunker, devastating in firepower, unreliable in movement, irreplaceable in loss. They assigned them to critical choke points, where the mere presence of a long-barreled silhouette delayed Soviet advances. But delayed was not the same as stopped. As Muller's tank rumbled through the forest on that humid August night, he considered the irony buried inside the metal around him. His orders demanded boldness. The machine demanded caution. The enemy demanded speed. The terrain demanded retreat. Conflicting forces pulled at every decision. The result was a perpetual state of tension between what the tank could do, what the tank should do, and what the tank would allow them to do without tearing itself apart. Smoke drifted low across the clearing as Muller finally opened the operations binder clipped to the turret wall. Fuel estimates, engagement ranges, recommended maintenance intervals that belonged in a factory, not a battlefield. All of it built on the assumption that the machine was perfect, but war had already proven it wasn't. He closed the binder and rested his forehead against the cool metal. The armor was thick, the expectations were heavier. Somewhere in the trees ahead, Soviet reconnaissance units repositioned for the next strike. They feared what the Germans had brought into the forest. Muller feared whether it would survive long enough to fire again. The forest tightened around the battalion like a closing fist. By late morning, humidity clung to every surface of the tank, turning steel into something that felt alive, breathing, expanding, threatening. The engine coughed once, then steadied. Muller listened to it the way a medic listens to a patient on the edge, attentive, skeptical, afraid of the next sound. The escalation came quietly at first. A distant crack, not artillery, not rifle fire, a tree collapsing. Then another. Then the unmistakable growl of engines advancing in formation. Soviet armor. The long gun on Muller's tank gave them an advantage at range, but the forest nullified that strength. Every tree became a barrier. Every branch stole a meter of visibility. The tank was built for open fields. The Eastern Front rarely offered them. The radio hissed to life. Recon reports multiple vehicles, likely T-34 SARs, moving south of your position. Prepare to engage. The driver exhaled sharply. The loader muttered a prayer. The gunner placed his hand on the elevation wheel like a man steadying himself before stepping onto thin ice. They advanced 10 meters before the first discovery hit them like a physical blow, not an enemy round, not an ambush, a grinding shriek beneath the hull. the kind every heavy tank crew learned to fear more than gunfire. The track had thrown itself partly out of alignment after striking a submerged tree stump, a minor issue for lighter vehicles. A catastrophic setback for a 50-ton machine with precision tolerances and fragile suspension components. The tank lurched, stopped, sank slightly into the wet soil. Muller closed his eyes. Not now. Extract from the battalion maintenance log. If a heavy tank halts unexpectedly, assume mechanical fault before enemy contact. Probability exceeds 60% during forest movement, but Soviet forces rarely waited for repair attempts. Through the periscope, Muller spotted movement, shadows slipping between trees, glimmers of sunlight bouncing off sloped armor plates. The T-34 SARs were spreading laterally, hunting by sound. Long range was gone. Mobility was gone. Only the gun remained, and even that required stable footing. Loader. OP loaded. Gunner. Ready. Another sound, cut through the cabin, coolant dripping onto metal. A hairline crack in the system from the earlier jolt now widened under heat. Time was collapsing. The gunner fired first, a blind shot into the trees guided by instinct and the glint of moving steel. The recoil rocked the hull, sending a jolt through already stressed components. For a moment the barrel seemed to sag unevenly before settling. A sharp explosion echoed back. A hit. One Soviet tank disabled. The enemy now knew exactly where they were. The forest erupted with return fire. Shells slammed into trunks, throwing splinters the size of daggers across the clearing. One round struck the tank's frontal armor at an angle. A metallic scream, sparks flying, no penetration, but the shock vibrated through the crew's bones. Inside the hull, the raw fear was different from what other tank crews felt. It wasn't just fear of death. It was fear of being trapped in something powerful yet uncontrollable. A machine that punished mistakes and magnified danger. Psychological insight repeated in German armored studies. Heavy tank crews experience dual stress, external threat and internal mechanical anxiety. Muller made a choice. Reverse. The driver hesitated. We'll tear the gearbox. Do it. The engine strained. The transmission growled. The tank moved 2 meters, then 3, dragging the misaligned track through mud like a wounded animal pulling itself uphill. A Soviet round struck the ground close enough to rattle teeth. The gunner fired again, barrel flashing through smoke. Another explosion in the distance. Another T-34 stopped moving. 2 down. More incoming. The next seconds unfolded with the strange clarity soldiers report only in near-death moments. White smoke from the coolant system, a burning resin smell rising from the clutch housing, the track jolting violently every meter. The tank was winning the firefight and losing the battle against itself. Muller understood the truth now. This wasn't a weapon. It was a negotiation with physics, engineering, and luck. Every shot a victory, every movement a gamble. Over the radio came the words he both needed and dreaded. Support units en route. Hold position. Hold position. In a crippled, overheating machine, against advancing Soviet armor, the forest darkened as storm clouds rolled overhead. Thunder echoed faintly, or maybe artillery. Hard to tell. Both had the same promise. The tank shuddered once more. Then the engine temperature spiked beyond safe limits. Muller whispered, "Not yet, not yet." The enemy was closing. The machine was failing. The crew stood between the two, armed with a weapon that inspired fear in everyone, including them. The storm broke at the worst possible moment. Rain hammered the treetops, turning smoke into a drifting curtain that blurred friend and foe into shifting silhouettes. For most tanks, rain offered concealment. For Muller's machine, it meant something else. Mud thickening around the already damaged track, coolant temperature falling unevenly, steam hiding the direction of leaks. Every drop felt like another variable slipping out of control. The Soviet armor closed in. Their engines growled through the downpour, steady and confident, lighter machines built for movement, not showpiece engineering. The T-34 SAR maneuvered through the forest with a flexibility Muller's crew could only envy. Inside the German tank, the temperature rose, despite the rain. A boiling metal box in a drowning world. Bearing left, the gunner whispered, adjusting by sound more than sight. A shadow drifted between 2 trees. Fire. The cannon roared, recoil slamming through the hull. A second Soviet tank vanished behind a burst of flame. For a moment, the German crew tasted triumph. Then the gearbox protested, a deep grinding refusal that echoed through the cabin. Mechanical crisis and enemy action collided. Extract from an interrogation report taken after the war, we feared its gun, not its speed. If we heard it firing, we spread out and waited for the machine to defeat itself. Another Soviet shell punched into a nearby tree, detonating bark and shrapnel across the clearing. The loader ducked instinctively, hands over his ears, heart pounding in a rhythm faster than the engine's failing hum. Target right. I see it. No right. Other right. Visibility was down to meters. Confusion pressed in. The gunner fired again. Too fast, too hopeful. The shell slammed into a trunk, shattering it, but missing the enemy. A reply came instantly. A Soviet round smashed into the turret's side. Not a penetration, but the shock rattled every bolt, every rib, every nerve. Inside, the loader's first words were not about the enemy. They'll break the turret ring, then we're stuck. Fear of the machine, fear of the enemy. Equal now, blurred, thunder rolled overhead, masking the first coordinated Soviet maneuver. Half a dozen infantry units moved in behind the armor, their silhouettes barely visible between flashes of lightning. Muller, the driver, said quietly, "We can't stay, we can't move," the commander answered. This was the turning point, the moment every heavy tank crew dreaded, when the battlefield demanded motion, and the machine refused. The Soviets circled like wolves around a wounded bull, not rushing, not risking direct frontal shots, waiting for the inevitable mechanical collapse that history had taught them to expect. A T-34 crept around the left flank, using the fallen trees as cover. Muller barked, "Traverse, traverse." The turret groaned as the motor forced metal against resistance. 5 degrees, 10, 15, then a grinding snap. The rotation slowed, uneven, but still moving. The gunner took the shot, a perfect strike. The Soviet tank erupted in a column of fire blackened by rain, but firing again cost them something vital, the recoil jarring an already delicate alignment, rupturing the coolant leak further, sending a hiss of white steam flooding the cabin. The crew coughed, eyes watering, breathing felt like inhaling a workshop exhaust. Another round whistled overhead, clipping the commander's cupola, denting steel inward like a crushed tin can. Muller steadied himself. He had one decision left, a decision most manuals never mentioned, because doctrine rarely acknowledged despair. "Driver," he said softly, "forward." But the track, forward, the tank lurched, dragged itself, screamed through metal, and surged 5 meters ahead, enough to break the encirclement line. Enough to live a little longer, enough to provoke the Soviets into closing fast. 2 enemy tanks charged through the smoke, their guns flashing. One round slammed into the German frontal armor and ricocheted upward into the canopy. Another missed by meters. The gunner fired again, a desperate punishing recoil that pushed the machine to its mechanical limits. Another hit, another T-34 silenced. But the crisis reached its breaking point. The final drive locked. The track twisted. The engine choked. The tank sagged to one side, immobile, a fortress again, but now a tomb, if the Soviets pressed. Inside, breath came in short, trembling gulps. The loader wiped coolant from his face. The driver whispered a second prayer, not for victory, but for a chance to escape, if fire reached the fuel stores. Muller gripped the hatch handle. Crisis had become inevitability. Enemy action had become certainty. Mechanical failure had become fate. Silence followed, the kind that doesn't belong on a battlefield. No engines, no shells, only the slow drip of coolant onto the hull floor and the distant crackle of a burning Soviet wreck. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath around the immobilized giant. Muller exhaled first. A long, resigned breath. The kind soldiers release when the fight ends, but danger hasn't. Outside, the rain softened into a steady patter. Smoke thinned, charred leaves floated through the clearing like dark snow. The forest had become a graveyard of metal shapes and shattered trees. The German heavy tank stood in the center, victorious, immobilized, overheating, dying. The loader spoke the truth. None of them wanted to say aloud, "We can't move, they'll be back with more." And they would. Soviet doctrine was simple. When a German heavy tank broke down, and they knew it would, Infantry units swarmed, sometimes with grenades, sometimes with anti-tank rifles, sometimes with nothing but determination and Molotov cocktails. Extract from Soviet Report, 1944. When the heavy model stops, assume mechanical collapse, surround from all sides. Avoid frontal attack, the machine is stronger than the men inside. Muller reached for the radio, static. Smoke damage from earlier hits had crippled reception. He tried again. A faint crackle, then a voice. Position repeat. Hold support delayed, enemy regrouping. The rest dissolved into static. Support was coming, but delayed, always delayed. The tank's condition stabilized only in the sense that it could no longer deteriorate much further. The engine had seized. The final drive was locked. The track was twisted like a ribbon. The turret rotation motor coughed once and died. All that remained operational was the gun, and even that was uncertain. The recoil mechanism protested. The breech was hot enough to burn bare skin. The loader's gloves smoked from the last shell. Muller examined the interior. Every surface dripped condensation. Every gauge leaned past comfortable thresholds. The smell of steam, metal, and fear created a heaviness no ventilation fan could disperse. Outside, shapes moved just beyond the tree line. Soviets, infantry. Advancing slowly, patiently, the gunner steadied his breathing and trained the barrel at the shadows. He knew what this phase was, the psychological turning point. The enemy had learned the machine was crippled. Now they tested its resolve, or its desperation. He fired. The blast illuminated the clearing for a split second. A figure dropped. Another dove behind a stump. The Soviets halted, reassessing. The German tank, even dying, still held power. But each shot was another nail in its coffin. The recoil worsened stress fractures, shook loose bolts, and heated the breach toward catastrophic levels. Muller understood the calculation the enemy was making. Let it kill a few more. It will kill itself. A phrase repeated in Allied intelligence summaries. Rain matted his hair as he cracked the hatch slightly, feeling the outside air. Steam roared out like breath from a wounded bull. The forest smelled of sap, fuel, and hot metal, a scent he would remember long after the war. A voice shouted in Russian, commands, footsteps scattered. Then unexpectedly, the sounds receded rather than approached. The enemy wasn't retreating, they were repositioning, and that terrified Muller more. He knew the Soviets were calling up something heavier, perhaps a pair of self-propelled guns or a tank destroyer unit, to finish what nature and engineering began. The driver looked up at him with the expression of a man ready to obey but preparing for the end. What now? Now, Muller said. We survive the next 10 minutes. He returned to the gunner, one shot at a time, make them count. The next shell cracked through the forest. Another Soviet soldier fell, another pause, another reassessment. The German heavy tank was bleeding out, but fighting still, a paradox of engineering triumph and battlefield liability, exactly as High Command never intended to admit. A second Russian shout echoed from the tree line, louder, more urgent, then the unmistakable clanking of tracks, light, rapid, maneuverable. A new unit had arrived to finish them. The crew felt the shift in air pressure before seeing anything. Storm clouds parted slightly. Lightning flashed. Rain thickened again. The battlefield was not done with them. But despite the tank's failures, something unexpected occurred next, something that would become a footnote in battalion records, and later, a debate among historians. Support arrived. Not from the rear, not from command, but from a lone accompanying tank, lighter, faster, less celebrated, but still operational. It burst through the tree line, with a speed the heavy model could never match, spraying suppressive fire, disrupting the Soviet encirclement. The infantry scattered. The tank destroyers halted. The balance of fear shifted once more. The immobilized heavy tank, feared by the enemy, hated by its own crew, lived long enough to see help. But survival was only temporary. Consequences, however, were not. Support changed the battle, but not the truth. The rescue tank forced the Soviets back long enough for engineers to reach Muller's vehicle. Under covering fire, they worked in mud up to their ankles, pulling at twisted track links, inspecting the seized final drive, tapping on armor plates, still hot from near misses. Rain poured over them, as if trying to cool metal that refused to surrender its heat. Their verdict came quietly. Not repairable here. A pause. Maybe not repairable anywhere. The storm began to pass, but the smell of burnt coolant and scorched paint lingered. Smoke rose from the wrecked Soviet armor scattered around the clearing, a testament to the tank's destructive brilliance. But beside that brilliance lay the undeniable weight of its flaws. Muller stared at his machine, the giant he commanded, the monster he survived. It looked immovable now, not as a fortress, but as a monument to German engineering ambition and German strategic desperation. He placed his gloved hand on the armor. It was cool now. Dead metal, extract from post-war armored core analysis. The heavy tank embodied Germany's late-war paradox, extraordinary firepower paired with crippling fragility. It ruled the battlefield in theory, but not in duration. As the engineers prepared demolition charges, the only safe way to prevent capture, the crew stood in silence. Soldiers form bonds with their machines, even flawed ones. They had fought, survived, and nearly died inside this steel cavern, and now they would watch it go. The driver whispered, "It saved us." The loader replied, "And nearly killed us." Both were true. Contradiction was its nature. Müller's internal conflict sharpened. He had long suspected what commanders in Berlin refused to admit. The tank was a weapon built for victories no longer possible. It demanded resources the Reich no longer possessed. It demanded terrain the Eastern Front no longer offered. It demanded perfection from men who received none of the conditions required to achieve it. War had outpaced the machine before it ever reached its potential. When the charges detonated, the explosion was strangely muted, the tank collapsing inward with a deep metallic sigh, as if relieved its own struggle had ended. Flames curled upward, orange against the grey Polish sky. The crew marched back toward friendly lines with support units, passing wrecks of both Soviet and German armor along the way. The forest was littered with evidence of every side's failures and triumphs, none lasting, none absolute. Hours later, in a makeshift command post, Müller wrote his report. He detailed the engagements. He noted the kills. He listed the mechanical failures with clinical accuracy. But at the end he added one line not found in manuals, doctrine or propaganda. The enemy feared our tank. We feared that it would not survive long enough to justify that fear. Historians would later call his battalion's action that day a tactical success and a logistical disaster. They would analyze the tank's performance, calculate its kill ratios, and debate its strategic value. But soldiers remember differently. They remember heat, noise, shuddering steel, the smell of burning coolant, the pressure of being inside a masterpiece that punished its own crew, the relief of stepping out alive. Legacy is complicated. The tank entered history as both a legend and a warning, the definitive proof that engineering brilliance cannot compensate for strategic exhaustion, crumbling supply lines, or the brutal mathematics of mass-produced enemy armor. It was feared because of what it could do. It was hated because of what it demanded. It was respected because of the men who made it fight anyway. In the end, the tank's greatest contradiction became its legacy: unmatched power built on unsustainable design. Victory bowed to physics, and fear bowed to reality.